Alright, my name is Taylor Bartek, and this is my presentation on the impact of the news media on domestic policy perceptions. I've listed my sources here. They were pretty beneficial in my research. Found most of them through EBSCO. Found that to be a pretty fruitful resource to be able to use. Jumping right into it, we're going to be talking about framing first, and framing is something that media outlets and policy advisors can use to sort of set a plot or create a sense of characters or kind of a moral guide within an issue of policy. And one of those things that they like to use is called conflict framing. Now, conflict framing is a frame that's focused more around the timing of when the opinion is released, and policy advisors will actually use this along with other frames as a method of stirring up emotions of a topic right ahead of a vote. So it kind of gets the voters thinking, but they don't really have time to digest and think it through logically. For example, a good example of this is in 2017 to 2019, the United States actually saw a large amount of policy in regards to immigration that was very positive be proposed, but yet the media chose to focus on a lot of negative aspects of the policies that were put forward. And as far as framing goes, the public is relatively already unaware of policy changes to begin with. There's a lot of empirical evidence out there and data that will show that. And so as far as knowledge suppression, there have been various media correspondents and outlets that have actually been accused of focusing on partisan divide and conflict rather than the policy changes and substance to how these things are going to affect citizens' everyday life. And the reason that they've been accused of doing this is kind of a method of retaining viewers, but ultimately they're found that it's restricting access to knowledge of these policy changes that voters could really use. And diving into the influences of it, and staying right along those lines of voting, the media has a huge impact on the voting because, like we had just mentioned, the frames that they use can really alter how voters learn about policy changes. And this ultimately boils down to affecting what voters choose to vote on. Now, something that I thought was very interesting and was actually one of my sources here in my research was how the media can influence investments, financial investments. For example, one of the sources here that I used was highlighting how investors are very hesitant to invest in a foreign country that the Wall Street Journal may actually kind of view as having a corrupt political landscape. So just one publication having enough of an impact to, sort of influence investors as far as where to put their money, shows and highlights kind of exactly how how substantial the influence is. And ultimately, this relates all back to policy because the media can persuade how the public feels about things and how they perceive things, and ultimately how they vote and how people vote with their money. It kind of guides the way towards what policies that tend to be addressed and even put forward in the public. Now, the Supreme Court justices recently have kind of been making a little bit of a notable reputation. Clarence Thomas specifically himself here has kind of developed a little bit of a reputation for making characterizations about the press, and oftentimes they find that he does so when he's referring to the First Amendment on some of his deliberations, and that the press there's research that has also noted about the deteriorating and what they call fragile relationship between the Supreme Court and the press. And they went on to note how, just one generation ago, the press was seen as this sort of check on the United States government, and that the courts held them in higher regard than the ones that previously do. And that the courts tended to see them more of a trustworthy institution, and that they could be granted some constitutional freedoms. And, it's just been continuously noted, and now the data has been released, and it relays back to one of my sources here about how there's a notable lack of praise where from 1970 to 1984, 11 of those 15 years that were observed, the Supreme Court actually issued overwhelmingly positive praise of the press, whereas from 2005 to 2019, they found that most of the time the Supreme Court was being a little more negative, and that their press positivity was more closer to a rate of around 19%. And ultimately, this brings us to the so what. Sorry, I accidentally kind of hit the spacebar and jumped a little forward there in the slideshow, but that brings us to the so what. And ultimately, I find that it's important because this whole topic to address, because it really leads people to kind of understand the importance of doing your own research when it comes to these policy changes, when it comes to proposals that might be put forward. We all love to be able to turn on the TV, turn on the news, and kind of get the convenience of just catching the highlights and moving on with our day. But oftentimes, we have to take into consideration where our source is from, and, kind of do a little more research on our own, do a little more digging to kind of formulate our own opinions. And the main reason that that's important is because it has an impact on everybody. We all vote. We're all citizens here that, show up on election day and take part. And every vote matters, and it impacts every single person here. So yeah, that about wraps it up. Thanks for listening to the presentation. Sorry if it's extremely monotone and boring.